Once grief and grieving enter our lives, I say, if you're lucky, it will continue for the rest of your life. Because at the end of the day, what is grieving? Grieving is a reflection of the love that you had for somebody when they were in their physical body. And so grieving is just loving them after they've died. So as long as you will love that person, the grieving will continue.
Hi, and welcome to After Peter Pan. I'm your host, Pat Tenneriello. When someone dies, most of us don't know what to do. We hopefully show up, but we feel awkward. We don't know what to say. And yet, death is the one certainty we all share. In this episode, I sit down with death doula Paul Simard to talk about why death makes us so uncomfortable. We explore grief, language, belief, and a perspective on death that completely reframes the conversation. I hope you enjoy the episode. We're in the throes of grief and loss right now. My wife recently lost her aunt. I'm in Italy right now. My wife's Italian. The first thing you do is you go over to their house, and depending where the death occurred, the body may be in the house, lying on the bed upstairs, or in the hospital. In this case, it was in the hospital, so her aunt's body wasn't there. But you just go and you be with the family at their home. And I was there, and I just felt awkward and uncomfortable. I'm sure a lot of people can relate to that. And I'm wondering, how do we be there for our loved ones in that sort of scene?
Yeah, it is a life-changing question that you're starting with. And the discomfort in particular is something that is really something that shouldn't be so foreign to us, right? And it's a big question. And I think when I hear that kind of question coming in, one of the first things that I want to make sure that I say is that there's no answer, right, to any of this. The best that we can do, I think, in this current moment is to kind of wonder aloud together and to navigate the experience, to come to something that maybe not so much gives us an answer as to why things are the way they are, but to maybe give us a sense of direction as to how things might be something different, how we might be able to be in a different way. Because we all know, I mean, we have all kinds of expressions around, death and taxes and the certainty we're all going to die and all of these things. And yet, you're right, it is very uncomfortable for so many people. And I would say for almost everyone, at least, and maybe especially those who are in what we would call the Western world, right? You're currently in Italy, and that's a part of the world that will have on the whole, the population there will be in much closer proximity to the way that their ancestors were with the dead and the dying. And as you said, you could have arrived and the aunt would have been there waiting in the living room. It's very possible. And in fact, that would have been an experience that would have been more likely than not for most of us. But she's at the hospital, right? And I think this is one of the places that we can start to look at this in terms of why have we become so uncomfortable? And I often say it's because for the large part, we have outsourced to other people, to other institutions, so much of this process around death and dying and even grieving to a certain degree, such that it's become unfamiliar to us and we don't come into contact. I mean, I'm not going to ask you to say how old you are, but, to be an adult and to have never really come into contact with death in a meaningful way or in a dying way is a very new phenomenon for the human experience. This is not something that has been happening for thousands and thousands of years. This is very, very new. And as a result of that lack of familiarity, it is easy to come to a place of fear, to come to a place of discomfort, to come to a place of feeling disempowered and unsure how to be in those moments, right? And I mean, we could certainly start to look at some of the specific questions that you asked around, like, what do I do in this moment? But I think it's really understanding first and foremost that there's no lack on your part or on anyone's part. There's no fault. We have all, for the most part, been socialized in this same social construct whereby anytime there's an illness, especially once it gets to be, terminal or these things, everything happens outside of our reach. It starts in hospitals and then moves to palliative care homes and then moves to funeral homes. And then depending on your belief system, you hand over the dead to some other, right? We're not responsible for the dead, right? So we don't come into contact with it, And as a psychologist will tell you, if you have a fear of something, one of the ways to navigate that fear is to come into contact with it, right?
Yeah, exposure therapy. Yeah.
Exposure therapy. Exactly. That's exactly right. And so our lack of exposure, and we continue to see this today, our lack of exposure continues to feed that. And I don't know if you have children, but I do know that I do. And, it was quite often asked by people in my family, like, well, why are you bringing your children to the funeral home? Like, what are you doing? It's like, what do you mean? What do you mean? Like, I understand that they maybe didn't have an intimate relationship with this person, but it's part of life, and I'm providing them with opportunities to come into contact with it. And we don't do that anymore. So as one of the places where we can start to look at this, we can absolutely start with the lack of exposure that we have. There's other things too. We have a bit of an entitlement, I say that generously. We have an entitlement, especially again here in the West, where when we're born, right, or when a child is born, there's this expectation around this long life, right? Of, when my children were born, it didn't enter my mind that they wouldn't live to be into their 80s and 90s, right? That there might be another alternative for them. There was just this expectation, right? And so a fear of death also comes from that as well, that it's somehow of an ending. It's a theft. Something is being missed out on by a death arriving at a certain time, even if it's sometimes in the 90s and, so on and so forth. But the example that I use in this case is for my mom. My mom died when she was 73 years old. And so many people said, oh my gosh, she was so young. And I was like, okay, yes. And I mean, I'm not being aloof about it in the moment, but when we think about this, 73 is young compared to the 95-year-old, perhaps. But how does that track against the 43-year-old or the 17-year-old, right? So what line in the sand becomes the point where it's okay to die? And the truth of the matter is that in so much of our Western culture, we're never really okay with it. It becomes a trauma. It becomes something that we have to deal with. It's not something that we find nourishment in, or that we are inspired by. Someone's life coming to its fullness is something that should be inspiring and should be a place to be curious and to find peace in. It's very much not that.
Well, you touched on some interesting, in our culture, definitely death and mortality is not something that is something we come into contact with. And like you say, that the fact that we don't, it probably increases the discomfort and fear, like you said. When I was in that house, I was thinking, okay, despite the discomfort, I showed up. Like that was like, okay, I'm here, I'm present. I think that's probably one of the most important things, is just showing up and being there, even if you're awkward, even if you don't know what to say, you have no words. And but the other thing going through my head is like, she's gone, and we're not talking about her, and like we're here for her because she's not here, but nobody's talking about her, talking about it. This feels off.
Mm-hmm.
How do you, so in your work as a death doula, one, I'd love to kind of define the term, because I don't think it's a term that everyone has heard of. And two, like in your work as a death doula, where you're providing guidance and you're being there, like what do you advise? And I don't know if it's advising is the right word, or like, how do you talk to people about that sort of thing?
Yeah. Well, let's do the death doula thing first, and then we'll do the death doula thing and actually get into it.
Perfect.
So, most people actually maybe haven't heard of a death doula, but the same number of people, which is to say most of them, will have heard of a birth doula, right? And so a birth doula is somebody who accompanies a woman, a partner, a family through the whole process of being pregnant and then birthing a child, right? And death doula essentially does the same thing, though we might also continue our work a little bit longer because the death will be, replaced, let's call it, by the grief. And so we can continue to accompany families as they navigate the grieving process or the grieving journey, because it really is not a process. It's something that is more of an exploration that we live. And I will speak about that in answering your question in a minute. So that's where a lot of the work of a death doula comes into place, right? Some of us, and this is kind of what we're actually doing in this moment, some of us also engage in wondering what it would look like to reshape the narrative, the construct that we hold in society around grief, dying, and death. And so the other thing that I do is come in and have conversations like this one, but I also 2 to 3 times a month gather people in community. I have an event that I've developed called Death Over Coffee, and people come and we meet in coffee shops, and 15 to 20 of us will come and explore our relationships to grief. Some people might be grieving, some people might be preparing for the death of a loved one, and some people are just curious. But what we're trying to do is actually gather around the fire, as we would have done in villages, not that long ago, and have conversations that we're not having in the public square, right? To use all the metaphors that are available to us. And so that is where I spend just as much, if not even more, of my energy and time reflecting upon is how do we normalize this, not in a normalizing mental health kind of way, but more in a bringing it back into our life kind of way. Where, as you said, and this is where I'm going to respond more directly to your inquiry, someone dies and we're in the room and we're gathering for this person, but no one's really talking about it, and she's gone, and the person is literally not present. It's strange. It feels odd, right? And I think a lot of it has to do, again, I'm using the word I think because I don't know. There is no answer here, but it feels like, with the time that I've spent around this, that one of the first places to start is actually our language, right? What are the words that we use in these moments? Because they will inform how we show up in these places. And in the English language, we use words like past and lost and gone. And all of these things say not now, not anymore, right? And that's very different than just saying dead, right? Dead is a state. Dead is actually still able to be present. And in fact, when we look at a lot of intact cultures, and intact just means that they continue to live very similarly to the way they would have, hundreds of years ago. Many of those intact cultures, in their language, they don't have anything that would sound like the past tense as it relates to speaking about the dead. They very much are in the present, right? And so, as an example, again, I mentioned my mom died in 2022. So she died in 2022, but my mom is still. And that's really an important nuance, that while it maybe doesn't feel so important because it sounds like semantics, but our words have energy attached to them, right? And a lot of people will say, but dead, that sounds so heavy. That sounds so, sad and like morbid, right? Well, it's also true. It's also true. And it's actually the most true of the words that we use. Let's look at the word lost as an example, right? If I say that I lost my mom, and I'm going to apologize to her because I didn't, I know exactly where she is. Not necessarily right there, but generally, you know what I mean? But there's a transgression on my part. I lost my wallet. The word lost is, I don't know where it is. I have done something and lost track of it, right? I lost my wallet. I lost my car keys. Heaven forbid, I lost my kid while they were in the grocery store. I've done something against that thing. I have caused something to become absent by my carelessness, essentially, right?
Hmm.
Of course, when somebody says that in everyday language, that's not what they mean. But again, the words do carry energy. And that lost means I no longer have at the end of the day. But I will always have a mom. I haven't lost her. She died. The same is true with the word past. It's just a little bit different, right? So when you think about, I use the highway as an analogy. When you pass a car on the highway, you can say, oh, I passed that guy. And what does that mean? It means left behind you. Now in my rearview mirror, no longer an ongoing concern, right? And so once again, when someone dies, we are leaving them behind is the energy that's there. And of course, again, nobody actually means that when they're saying it. Nobody actually means that, but it's there. Our words have spells. Everyone loves the idea of like affirmations, right? So I am strong, I am powerful, I am man. And why do we do that? Because our words have power. Our words have energy. They have meaning. We don't get to choose which words do and which words don't. That's not how that works. We don't get to say, I am strong, I'm giving those words power, and my mom passed away, there's no power there. That's not how it works, right?
Right.
And so to come to your exact point of what do you do in this moment? Well, speak about the aunt as if she is, because she is. Nothing has changed in terms of who she was, in terms of who she, how she loved, none of that has actually changed. It all still is. She's just died.
I see. So what would be an example of something to say in that case that would be aligned with what you're describing? Because on the one hand, I understand the accuracy of what you're saying. I do believe that words carry energy and carry feeling, and that's why people do for affirmations, like you say. At the same time, I would be more cautious about how my words impact others, right? Like the people that I'm there for. And I don't, dead just sounds, I don't know, like, is it insensitive or something? Like, it's to your point, right? It's not how we're used to communicating it. So it may come across the wrong way.
Well, and I mean, again, but it's also something that so you want to answer your question directly, obviously you want to be very respectful of the people and their ways of being, right? And so I'm not inviting you or suggesting that you should drop, let's call her Sylvia for lack of a better name right now. And, like Aunt Sylvia died, Aunt Sylvia's dead. Like it shouldn't be every second sentence, right? There's a respect there because not everyone will be ready to receive that. And they may feel that it is a little bit.
Where did you what made you think of Sylvia, out of curiosity, Paul?
It just came up.
Oh, that's wild because her name is Silvana. And she was 73 when she passed, the same age as your mother.
Wow. Okay. Well, then
just some of these coincidences were just the age was like, okay, but then you got the name pretty much spot on. I'm like, what's going on here?
Well, I mean, at the end of the day, we're not going to get into that part of the conversation. Let's leave that aside for the moment. But it's about being sensitive. It is about being sensitive and being open, but it's also about allowing space for a different way of being. And my recommendation to everybody is to try these things on, right? It may not be the thing that serves and supports you. So when I'm working with a family, I do encourage them to speak about their loved one in the present tense. And if it doesn't feel right, two things. One, it's a new muscle. So don't give up on it on the first time. But also listen to yourself. Be aware of what's happening in your body. Grieving is something that we are meant to, in fact, be very, very present with. It's not a process to bypass. It's not a process to even get through. Once grief and grieving enter our lives, I say, if you're lucky, it will continue for the rest of your life. Because at the end of the day, what is grieving? Grieving is a reflection of the love that you had for somebody when they were in their physical body. And so grieving is just loving them after they've died. So as long as you will love that person, the grieving will continue. My father's going to grieve my mother for the rest of his life. I will as well. We will continue to grieve her for the rest of our lives because we still love her and she's not gone. She's very much a vibrant part of our lives. I mean, her way of being is a lot of what informed me in becoming a death doula. It, to me, is one of the most powerful ways that I can serve. And my mom is all about service, whether you're coming over for dinner or she's active in the community, it's all about the service. And so this is part of what informs that. So it's really about, disrespecting or not correcting others either, right? Like it's not, you shouldn't say that she's passed or you shouldn't say that she's gone. But if you do say that, Aunt Silvana died and somebody asks you, oh, is it possible for you not to? You can say, well, yes, I appreciate what you're saying and I'll be more careful. But I also very much feel as though Aunt Silvana, isn't past and she's not lost, but she has died. And that's why I said it in that way. It was meant to be very loving and respectful. And yeah. I want her to be among us, right? And the Italian culture, if I remember correctly, you'll know this better, but I believe they were one of the cultures who actually, when someone would die in the village, there were people within the village who took on the role of like professional grievers. They were called into service to begin the grieving process, to get the wailing going, and to make sure that everybody knew that they were being called into the grieving process. It was something that was done collectively and publicly. And that's not just in Italy, it's, all over. The whole idea of a wake, right? In the Irish tradition, that comes from everybody gathering together in the echoes of someone's life and celebrating it together, with Guinness and other things. And of course there was sadness.
Yeah.
But there was no sense of loss.
Right. Yeah. I don't know. Not where we are. That didn't happen here in this community, but I would say that in contrast to sort of this idea of celebration of life, like the Irish might do, in Italy, it's quite let's call it like a somber thing. It's, but I would say it was remarkable how many people turned up. I was amazed just it felt like everyone came, you know what I mean? And they stayed, they didn't just pop their head in, give them a hug and leave. They stuck around.
Yeah.
And so that stuck with me.
It's that sense of responsibility, right? It's that someone has died and it is our responsibility to grieve that person's life. They contributed, they meant something, they mean something still. Look at all of us who are here, right? And it's not only in honor of the person who died, but it's also a recognition of those who are now in a position to sustain her, right? Like through your remembering, through your bringing her and inviting her into the room, right? You're actually sustaining her. Somebody, I heard the expression once, somebody said, humans actually we all carry a superpower. We can make someone live forever just by continuing to remember them. It's just, how do we remember them? Do we remember them as being in the past and left behind, or do we remember them? Remember etymologically is put back together again, right? So do we remember them, call them back into existence before us as if they were?
You've sat with people at the very end of their life. That's part of the work that you do. We're talking about how we're there for others and our loved ones, but also the people themselves that are facing death. What do they often realize too late about how they lived?
It's a common inquiry, right? And I think that for the most part, we have these ideas of people coming to these these moments of realization, of awareness. And in my experience, those moments are more rare than we might imagine they are. And more often than not, what people are coming into contact with instead of these sort of eureka moments is more of a softness, more of a softening around relationship, around how they view the people in their lives, around, I'll share one example of, a family that I spent over a year with. And as the mother was coming to the end of her life in the last, let's call it 3 months or so, we started to open up sort of the way that she had been relating with, so it was her daughter. So her daughter's husband's family. And there was a lot of resistance, cultural differences there, and old school ways of thinking that were very, very divergent, to the point of like, couldn't be around each other almost in some ways. And we just continued to explore that relationship and to wonder about what else might be possible in their way of being, especially during this time where her primary relationship was with her daughter, that she was very concerned about how everything there was affecting the daughter, right? And so exploring the relationship that she had with her son-in-law was one of the ways that she was seeking to, pull that Venn diagram of the three of their lives a little bit closer together. And her openness to what that might look like, to what might be possible in those moments, actually resulted, Pat, it was so beautiful to see, because in the last sort of 2.5 to 3 weeks of her life, he became her rock. He became the one that she would ask for first in certain moments.
Interesting.
It was so powerful that the softening and the openness that she exhibited to allowing him to come in. I mean, there was always, I think, a love and appreciation that was there underlying, but that wasn't necessarily quite as overt. But this shift was unbelievable. And so it really, and of course we're talking about here too, in the moments when people actually do have the time to be able to come into contact, because we also have, obviously sudden deaths that make this more challenging, or so on and so forth. But, in those people who have had the time, I've found more that it is the softening around certain ways of being in the world, rather than any kind of eureka moment, or I wish I had done this or that, more often than not.
And what that softening, where do you think that it comes from? Is it a desire for connectedness? Like in that example, it's like, I wanted, my daughter, the relationship with my daughter is important, accepting the other person I've had a hard time with. What would you say is the underlying reason for that softness and openness?
It's going to be different for everyone, of course, in terms of if we want to name a specific reason. And I can also tell you that in this particular case, as an example, there was a lot of resistance around the whole idea of dying at all. And I think once someone allows their dying to have its full presence in the room, that in that moment, there's an allowance that happens. There's a release. That to me is what really happens. It's whether they would be able to speak to it or not, it's the allowing of, I'm dying, to actually be, pardon the expression, but to actually be alive in their body, that opens them up, right? And what's interesting in all of that, and this is something that even I'm, doing what I can to try to learn to live in this way, but is that is in fact always true, right? And that it is actually something that is always available to us, that softness, right? That openness. It's typically fear that keeps us, and now we're back to fear of death and fear of any kind, that keeps us kind of like tightened and closed off to that. But when we allow really love to hold that fear, and then that is what softens the fear, and then that's what allows it to fully open up.
Yeah, that acceptance that we're going to die, if we could have that in the present, every day, I would imagine we would live we pretend like we're going to live forever.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of people do. And so the idea of death is pushed off into an infinite tomorrow.
Mm-hmm.
How can we bring that into that acceptance of mortality? Like, I just see so much potential if we were able to do that. People who can live with the idea of like, this is finite. I need to make the most of it. I need to live today like it could be my last.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure in your coffee group, like these sorts of topics must come up. I'd love to hear your perspective.
Well, what's interesting about that is that first of all, it absolutely does. And everything in the way that you've just framed it puts me at the center, right? So I would live in a different way. I. And that's a very Western way of viewing things. You know, we've kind of taken the word sovereignty and we've turned it on its head to mean something that it actually didn't originally. But we celebrate sovereignty. We celebrate the individual self, right? And you can think of that as sovereign countries, right? A country that is sovereign is meant to be able to sustain and support itself and not be, reliant on other countries, which of course we know is not true, but we have the same view of it for ourselves, right?
Hmm.
And so part of our struggle with what you've just outlined is the fact that my priority is supposed to be my sovereignty. And the thing that we celebrate and what we see in others is somebody who acts in their full sovereignty in the way that we mean it today. Right. So it's a very anthropomorphic or anthropocentric way of seeing things to ask people to live in such a way where they could accept dying any day. And so live their life to the fullest. On the other hand, there is a way of viewing death where it becomes something that in fact is a privilege and is in service to. And there's some strange but obvious ways in which that becomes true. I mean, let's look first of all at the sheer math problem, right? So when someone dies, they're in service to new life because they create space on the planet. We already know that we cannot support an infinite number of humans on this planet. And so death is necessary in that regards in order for new life to be able to be possible, right? So just from a pure numbers point of view, when someone dies, it's in service to life, right? But when someone dies, it's also to a certain degree, it is a way for them to really become a teacher in a whole other way, right? So how can I be in service to those people? Well, my life can leave some kind of a legacy. And again, I like to use personal examples. And so, my mother's life continues to inform people in ways of being. They may not speak her name, but she's influenced people by the way she lived and she shaped how they behave, right? And her death is an opportunity for us to acknowledge her legacy, to acknowledge her beyond her body, because we are so tied in the West here to our physical bodies. The idea that I would love somebody, who I've never met in the same way that I've loved my children is very foreign to us because I've never come into physical contact with them. We talk about unconditional love, but we don't really know what that means. And what my mother's death has offered myself and others an opportunity to do is through her legacy, love her without her body being necessary, right? And she serves and supports us in that way. So I also there's a beautiful story that I first heard from another elder. And I think this to me shows exactly how death can be in service. And it's a little bit like the numbers game example, but it's also a little bit different. And he tells the story of a story that he heard from a man from an indigenous community. And the great grandfather at that time was continuing to move with the family. They were still somewhat nomadic and they were making their way towards what would eventually be winter camp. And the going was a little bit hard and it was becoming more and more clear that this great grandfather was in fact slowing down the tribe, right? The community of people. No one was speaking it. No one was saying anything about it. They were just continuing to move as if. And at one point, he put his hand on his grandson's shoulder, who was in his late 20s or so. And they just kind of made their way off the path that the village was taking. And he went and they sat together for, I believe it was a day or two, and he died. At which point, the grandson made his way back towards the village. And it was a death that was very much in service to the survival of the village. That kind of way of being in the world is very foreign to us, In fact, when somebody accepts their own death, quite often, those of us who will live will get angry at them. No, you have to fight. I don't want to lose you. Right? And it actually puts a lot of pressure on the person who's dying. It makes their dying not okay for themselves because they're afraid of the pain they're going to cause to others when we do that. Right?
Yeah. Wow. I've never thought about as death as an act of service. That's a really interesting consideration. And just hearing you describe it like that, it reduces fear of death. Just to consider it that way. I was thinking it more of it in terms of like being a couch potato, and it's like, you know, you have a list of things you want to accomplish in your life and you're acting like you're going to live forever, and you lose a day and you lose a day and the weekend's gone. And so I was thinking about it more like that. How can you create a sense of urgency with knowing that you're mortal and you're not going to be around forever? But so I hadn't even expected that answer, but I find that really, really fascinating. And then you were talking about the West and this idea of like, you can't leave me, you can't, you know, to fight. And that reminded me of a book I just finished by Eckhart Tolle. I don't know if you've ever read Eckhart Tolle. It's The Power of Now. And he talks about the West and the West culturally, you know, we are human beings, he says. And in the West, we're obsessed with the word human and we forget the word being. And with human, he talks about form, but we are also formless. And that's the part in the West that we forget, the being, the formless. We're tied in human, the form, the ego. And so I like the way he frames that. And the way you're talking reminds me of that framing with Western culture versus some of that collectivist, some of these collectivist cultures that are more focused on community and being.
I mean, yes, absolutely. First of all, I love Eckhart Tolle. I mean, I think he's truly brilliant mind. And I align with that way of thinking very, very much. So we do not really have much of a relationship with our dead here in the West either. Right. And again, a lot of it is tied to our language, the past, the lost, the goneness. Right. Some of your listeners might have actually, just to give them a tangible example of what this can look like, some of the people who are listening or watching this may have seen the show This Is Us. And if you haven't, it's a great show and I recommend it. But there's one moment where the primary character, Jack, gets a phone call and he learns that his mother has died. And he hangs up the phone and he turns to his wife, Rebecca, and he's got this obviously bad news, forlorn look on his face. And he said, "My mom just passed away." And then he looks at her and says, "I don't have a mom." And it was like my whole body rejected the whole scene because of course he still has a mom, right? But she's just died. But it's a great example of how we now view an absence, a void, a gap in the place of something that was once there physically, right? We attach so much of it to the physical body. But, you know, when it wasn't that long ago. So my family lineage is a lot from England and Wales and northern France and stuff like that, places like that, as well as some local lineage as well. But it wasn't that long ago where my ancestors, again, were first of all speaking of the dead in the present tense and also knew exactly where all of the bodies of those ancestors were buried. And it is not uncommon here, and spent time with those bodies. They were part of the daily life. The idea of receiving food and making the first portion of food an offering that is separated to then bring to the ancestors because they made you possible and you were seeking to nourish them through gratitude still. That's not that far back in my own lineage as a white, Westerner here today. It wasn't that long ago. And that's been completely left behind us, right? And we will go and we'll maybe visit the graves of our loved ones at a sometimes far off distant place, but they're no longer a part of our day-to-day home lives. And for obvious reasons, they can't necessarily be, buried on the land where we are today. But in terms of the day-to-day movement, we really have left our dead behind. And so the question becomes, how do we claim them in such a way so that they actually are recognized and honored for their role in shaping us as who we are? Because here's where that takes us. That actually is one of the things that gives us a sense of belonging in the world. When we know where we came from, when we can speak about ancestor and we claim them as our ancestors, it provides us with a sense of belonging, but without it, we're completely disconnected. We're cutting threads, and it leaves us wondering, well, who am I? Do I belong here?
This conversation is sort of being framed in two directions in my mind. One is at a macro level, like us as a culture. These are some of the things that we need to grapple with. Mm-hmm. And part of your role as a death doula is you work one-on-one with people, but you also are trying to move that conversation forward, bring it out and see what sort of change can transpire.
Yes.
So bringing it down to the individual level again, what can we do at the individual level to prepare for mortality? What can we do? Yeah. What can we do to prepare?
Yeah. It's beautiful. I love this question. So thank you for asking it. And I think one of the first things that we can do is actually just learn our lineage, right? And sure, that can involve, what is it? 1, 2, 3, whatever it is, DNA testing and all. But I'm not sure how much that actually tells you about the people in your life. But there are lots of ways, and ancestry is one of them. And, there are other ways as well, but just get to start with the names of your ancestors, learn who they were. It wasn't that long ago where, I didn't even actually know that my great, great, great grandmother was Mi'kmaq, here from the indigenous lands in what is now known as Canada. And I'm saying 6 years ago, I didn't know that. It was something we didn't talk about. And she certainly didn't have a name. And when that came into my awareness, I was kind of torn as to what to do with it. What do I do with this information? And at the end of the day, I was provided, the advice of just sit with her. Just sit with Grandmama Marie, and let you feel her inside of you. So just doing some very quote unquote basic research. And most people know their grandparents' names, but how many of us know our great-grandparents' names? And how many of us know our great-great-grandparents' names, right? So just start by, we want to leave here's again, sorry to go socio on you, but we will bring it to the individual. But, we're taught to leave our past behind us, right? To live in the present. And I'm someone who firmly believes that in fact, it's a false god. We can't live in the present. And the reason we can't live in the present is because the minute we're aware of the present, it's already in the past. It's already behind us. And any experience that you're having of me and any experience that I'm having of you is not something that comes in this moment called the present. It's actually the most recent version I can access of the past. So everything you and I have experienced with each other today, it's all in the most recent version of the past of me and the past of you. And so shouldn't we be embracing it? Shouldn't we be celebrating it? Shouldn't we be understanding what came before the physical expression of this version of me? So I embrace and I encourage people to embrace their past, to not try to leave it behind, to understand that it's informing the most recent experience that they can have about themselves. That's a lot of woo-woo, but when you bring it down to the individual level, as you're asking, when we start to look beyond ourselves in the rearview mirror, again, to leave it behind us as we have been doing so far to make it easy linguistically, we start to feel that sense of belonging, like, oh, I come from these people. And who knows what you're going to find about those people if you do start to dig. And that starts to, again, provide you, even when the stories are a little bit harder. Maybe there's someone who owned slaves. Maybe there's somebody who committed violent crimes. But you start to get a sense of who you actually are and what you're constituted of. So that's one of the things. I think the other thing we can do as a people is, as individuals anyways, is when the opportunities present themselves to be in the presence and in contact with someone who is dying, to the extent that we're possible, to be with the person who's dying. Not to try to fix them, not to try to problem solve, just be with them, right? If we're going to outsource the whole process to doctors and palliative care nurses and all of these things, then let us at least not outsource the being human part. Back to Eckhart Tolle. Let us be truly and fully be with the dying, right? I think that's also a very, very important part. I think being aware of our language is an important part, right? So again, back to the past, gone, lost. I think the way we are with our children is very important, right? And so including them, even when others say it doesn't make sense, bringing them to the funeral home, bringing them into the palliative care residence. She was then 4.5. She's now 7. My 4.5-year-old niece at the time of my mom's dying was at the palliative care residence every single day. And every single day, up until the last 2 days before she died, she spent some time with my mom. That is going to serve and support her. I mean, it already is, but as she moves through life and she comes into contact with everything from health challenges to other people dying, and actually her great-grandmother just died recently, but it's not going to make it any less sad, but it is going to be something that she is not going to be traumatized by. It's not going to lock her in place, which is what trauma is, right? The body kind of experiences something and doesn't know how to let go of it, doesn't know how to move it through. Gabor Mate says, trauma isn't the thing that happens to you, it's what your body does with the thing that happened, right? And we need to be able to allow our bodies to embrace the death of a loved one, to allow it to come into our experience so that it can nourish and feed us. Because that's what death is meant to actually do. And that's what grieving is meant to do.
What do you think is the role of spirituality, religion, faith when it comes to mortality? For example, someone who's believes that when we die, nothing happens. It's just eternal nothingness, black. And then someone who thinks, well, no, when, my faith, if once we pass, I'll be reunited with the loved ones I've lost. And so to confront their mortality, I mean, option B seems like it'd be a little bit less scary. So how do you think about faith, religion, and spirituality on the context of mortality?
So I'm completely agnostic when it comes to what someone's belief systems might be. I always start, and let's just provide a little bit of etymological fun here for our listeners, belief being the core here, right? And now, by the way, I'm just going to let you know, we're going to say the word belief and believe about 22 times in the next 3 minutes, because that's what happens when you invoke belief. So let's first look at the etymology of the word belief. And I love the etymology for the word belief because, one, it's very, very powerful. And two, it is structured in such a way where I get to have a little bit of poetic license in how to wrap up the etymological meaning of it. So it's an old Anglo-Saxon word, and the B in this particular case means the expansion of the making bigger the growing capacity of the thing that follows. And the lief is actually love. So a belief is something that is meant to amplify and to grow, right? The capacity for love. And the poetic license comes in service to you, leading the life that you would wish for yourself. That's what a belief is meant to do. It's meant to be something that allows you to live the life in the way that you would want it to be lived, full and caring and full of concern and joy and all of these things, and not without sadness, but with sadness being understood to be a part of it, right? So, and a belief in my mind as well, in the way that I use beliefs and think of beliefs, is they're also always asking us to test them to make sure that they continue to be in service in that way. And so I was raised in the Roman Catholic tradition. I have nothing really against it as a system per se, as a religion per se. But one of the fundamental ways of thinking in that particular tradition is Judgment Day, right? And that there's a fear of God that also is a part of that. And so, to live your life in such a way where you're expecting to be judged at the end and you don't know what the outcome's going to be and you don't know what the score is at any given moment. And it's all in God's hands. And by the way, God is judgmental the same way you are. And you're super judgmental. Like, that's a great way to make sure my nervous system is completely wound up tight against the notions around death, dying, and what happens after. Right. So my invitation in those moments is always to, okay, well, what else might be possible for you within that tradition, right? And I don't have the answer, but that particular belief can keep people stuck, and it can really, I've seen it lead to some very tense dying processes, is the way because of that fear. When someone is dying with that fear as the dominant concern, as what they're thinking about more than anything else, it really affects their capacity to quote unquote die well.
I see. So they're grappling with like guilt or shame or something.
They're just afraid of, was it enough? Because they know they weren't perfect. They know that they were not without quote unquote sin. And so there's that fear that God is in fact judgmental. And often what we end up discussing is, well, wait, do we know that God is judgmental? And why would God even be judgmental? And what I have seen is that people are able to relax their belief that God is in fact as judgmental as they were led to believe, and that, actually, if God is God, then he needs nothing of me and he asks nothing of me, and I am his perfect creation. And I have seen that come into play, but it takes some doing.
Yeah, it sounds like it's kind of like the Old Testament way of thinking and the New Testament way of thinking. Mm-hmm. So I think the broader point you might be making is that viewed through different lenses, belief has the potential to be really helpful in mortality, but also to be a hindrance, and depending how it's being portrayed.
So if you're an atheist and you believe that there's nothing after, that you just die and you go into the ground and you're processed by, mushrooms and your body is just decomposed, and that supports you in living a very full life in honor and service of others and in, beautiful relationship, great. That's perfect. And the same would be true if you're of the Jewish faith, or if you're of the, at the end of the day, the belief system itself is less important than what it pulls you in the direction of in terms of the expression of your life.
Well said. Earlier in the conversation, you were tempted to go down a path, and then you said, no, I'm not going to go there. I'm really curious to know what path you wanted to go down there. It was under the context of the names when you mentioned Sylvia, and you were pretty identical to the aunt and wife's aunt's name.
Right. And so part of this is also, and this is, again, a fundamental belief, right? So fundamentally, what I'm about to share is a belief, and I wasn't sure we were going to go there, which is why I stayed away from it. But at the end of the day, you know, my belief system is one whereby our physical bodies are, in fact, the smallest parts of ourselves, right? That is my belief system. The smallest part of me, and I don't mean small and insignificant, but I mean the thing that defines me, the smallest part of me is the physical body, right? I mean, just the thoughts, for example, that we've been sharing today, the thoughts and reflections that we've been kind of moving through together, those are pulled from so many different places, from places so far beyond me, but that constitute me, that they make me up as a being. They wouldn't even be able to fit in this room, never mind, this body. So I have a belief system whereby at the end of the day too, I also believe that, okay, we're going to get into it. All right. You asked for it. So I believe that, and whether it's God or universe or love or whatever term you want to use, but when we talk about, why are we here kind of language, I believe at the end of the day, what we all are is really the universe finding all the different ways it can express itself and be experienced in service to itself, right? So that person, which is Pat, that includes all of Pat's experiences, that includes his wife, his children, the things they're going to do together. I mean, that's a very unique and never to be repeated again experience that the universe is having around and through this body that is called Pat, right? But at the end of the day, we are all the universe. And without tying it to any religion, we could also say we're all God, right? And when you also allow that as being a part of your belief system, you understand that all you're really doing when you die is letting something go. And so, do I want to live as long as I possibly can? Yes. I'm not interested in 150 years, mind you. That's way too much time in retirement. But I want to live as long a life as I can, and to be able to witness as much as I can of my children's experience. And when my own death, should it be something that comes into my awareness, as opposed to something that is sudden, when my own death comes, there's likely to be some resistance and some friction in my own. I'm not immune to those things, but I have come to a place where I feel, and I got to see this in the way that my mother died too, where I do feel as though really it's no more than a return. I mean, I was not for a lot longer before I ever was. And I will be no more a lot longer than I ever was as well. And so I've come into contact with that as a belief system. And it is something that survives every time I inquire whether or not it still serves me. So what I said earlier about beliefs, it wants me to challenge it and to test it to make sure that it still serves me in support of the life I want to live. And that one does. And I haven't come across anything that would lead me to believe that it will shift anytime soon. But the only reason why I resisted that, at the initial moment, was because it was taking us in a direction that was a little less around direct conversation with death and dying and more around belief systems.
To hear your belief, perhaps because some of it overlaps with my own, but I think I felt a feeling of peace and calm, of comfort, to hear you walk through that with me. I was thinking the absence of a belief, like your belief may not overlap 100% with mine, and everyone has their own belief, but having a belief, even if that belief is I become mushroom, is still more comforting and peaceful and powerful than the absence of a belief. So in that regard, tying it back to mortality, these emotions I felt as you described this, those are the types of emotions I hope I can feel when talking about such a uncomfortable, painful, difficult topic like death.
Which, painful, difficult topic like death, and it shouldn't be, right? And it wasn't always this way. This was in fact, again, this is just me feeling into what feels like it would have been true for the time, but I'm not sure the conversations around death, dying, and grief were even necessary 200 years ago, 250 years ago. We wouldn't have needed to normalize it. It was just what was happening. There was the understanding. One of my absolute favorite sayings is that, and this is all based on the fact that and it is something that I'm pretty sure, at least this version of it is my own, but I'm sure others have said it. There's no original thoughts, right? But this comes from the fact that here in the West, we celebrate life. I mean, we hold it up on a pedestal. It is revered. It is protected. When you think back to COVID and that whole moment in time, I mean, what were we trying to do? We were trying to defeat death, defeat COVID in order to protect life, even if that meant protecting life at the expense of the future, because we spent a lot of time protecting the elderly and applying the same practices to the children. And I'm not sure that they were both protective to those two demographics in the same way. So we celebrate life. It's this incredible thing, right? And we've forgotten the one thing that is absolutely necessary for life, and that's death. Life is literally not possible without death. The opposite's not true. Death doesn't need life. It doesn't need anything. It's death, right? And so with the reverence with which we hold life, and I'm not saying that we make of life like a god, but we kind of revere it as such. But if life needs something, then that lowers the bar from it ever becoming a god, because gods don't need anything. They're gods, right? At least not the anthropomorphic ones. The anthropomorphic ones need lots, but the ones that aren't so much so don't. And
Can I push that just a little bit?
Yeah.
So, Paul, just so death doesn't need life, life needs death. What if someone says, well, why can't life be eternal? Like, why does life need death?
Okay. So because it needs to consume, right? In order for me to be sustained, I need to consume. We know that, right? And in fact, I consume whether I need it or not. I mean, Amazon being the ultimate example of that, we consume on things we don't need all the time. But in order for me to be sustained, I need to consume, right? And in order for me to consume, something needs to end in the form that it was. Something needs to end in the form that it was. And whether you're talking about a cow or a pig or a carrot or broccoli, that thing is going to change. So that thing is going to come to an end, right? Human life has become the only thing that when it ends, no longer, again, for the most part, here in the West, it's changing. Some people are going back and doing green burials and things like that. So we're actually starting to feed things again. But for much of the last 100 years, let's call it, we're the only things that upon death, we didn't actually feed something. We go into metal boxes and, urns and marble walls, and we're put on display, and we don't nourish upon our death, especially here in the West. And so we've removed ourselves from the food chain to a certain degree, right? But our ancestors, again, go to Wales, go to some of these places around the world, and the hills are lush with our ancestors at the end of the day, right? We talked about it a little bit earlier. From a pure numbers perspective, if we live forever, then life will end. It's impossible for us to never die and still stay on this planet. Okay, so if you want to do like Elon Musk and go to Mars and do all those things, off you go. I'll even contribute. I'll pay for part of your ticket if that's what you want to do. Off you go. More space for us down here on this beautiful planet. if people stop dying, then life becomes less and less tenable, especially new life, right?
Mm.
But even now, if we stopped everyone from dying and we allowed everyone else to grow to full maturity, right, that's been born, and to continue to bring in new life, life will end. The planet will collapse in a way that can support us. The planet will actually be just fine. It'll figure itself out, but we as a species will no longer be sustainable, right?
Okay. Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
and again, anything that is alive as we know it needs to consume. So death can't end. And here's the thing, and this is probably and this is just coming to me now, but part of your question was not about death per se, but about human death. You're separating human death from death, right? And that once again puts us at the center of the universe. That puts us at the top of the hierarchy and removed from the food chain. I'm not so sure that that's a sustainable way of being for people.
Paul, I really enjoying this conversation. I hate to have to bring it to a close, but we're getting to that time. I usually end all of my conversations with this question, but I'm actually going to do a different question, I think, because there's one area we didn't get a chance to get to. Mortality in the context of purpose and meaning. How can we hold mortality and help it to help our lives have meaning and purpose around that topic of mortality? And if you want to frame that under the lens of masculinity, the work that I know you're doing in that space.
You know, the short answer, if you will, but I think it's a powerful answer, and I think it's true, that a life of meaning comes from a life of presence, right? When we're fully in our life, right? When we slow things down, our mortality becomes, I don't want to say it's something that we don't think about but it's certainly not something that we freak out about. It's not something that becomes fearful, because we start to understand sort of the more universal way that this planet that we're living on sustains itself, right? We understand that it's not about metrics and KPIs and all of these other things. And it's not about things, because we're on the subject of mortality and masculinity. There's a gentleman by the name of Brian Johnson who's got this movement called Don't Die.
I was going to ask you, I was thinking about your thoughts on his slogan.
Well, but his slogan is like a global movement of people committed to not dying. And this is the part that is the hubris in this part is unbelievable. It ends with, because we have stuff to do. What stuff? What does that even mean? And how is that meant to be the reason for us to stop, to remove ourselves from the cycle of life on this planet? So when we slow down, when we offer presence to ourselves in our own lives, we start to get closer to that thing that we talked about earlier, which is that our death actually becomes in service, because our life was. And someone's death actually makes it possible for someone else to come in and, through the resonance of your life, create something that wouldn't have been possible were you still there.
Paul, what a great way to end the conversation. I really want to thank you for taking the time to come on the podcast. It's been a real pleasure to talk about this topic. I don't even want to say difficult topic anymore, because it doesn't feel as difficult having had this conversation. So thank you.
Thank you. It was a real pleasure, Pat. It was good to be with you today.
Well, that's a wrap on this episode of the After Peter Pan podcast. I hope you found it insightful. If you did, please drop us a rating. Give us a like. It really helps to widen our audience and grow our community base. Thank you again for tuning in, and until next time.